Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling The Novel of the Black Seal by Arthur Machen, published in the year 1895. A young woman recounts how she entered the service of a scholar who was pursuing an ancient secret, a conjecture so monstrous that he scarcely dared to speak it, and one that in the end led him into the silent hills of Wales, from which he did not return. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into a gray London where this story begins on a cold winter evening. My name is Mary Lally, and I wish to set down here what I know about the disappearance of Professor Gregg, for I am the only one who knows it, and no one has believed me. My road to him began in the darkest time of my life. I had been orphaned early, had brought myself through the years with tutoring and copying work, and stood that winter in London entirely without means. I still had a few coins. My room had been given up, and for days I walked the wet streets from one advertisement to the next, and everywhere I had come too late or was not finely enough dressed. There was an evening on which I stood on a bridge and looked down into the black water and thought thoughts that today I would wish on no one. The next day, in a reading room into which I had sat myself for the warmth, I fell into conversation with a gentleman who evidently saw my distress without my speaking it. He was about 50, gaunt, with alert gray eyes and the impatient kindliness of a man whose head is always in two places at once. It was Professor Gregg, the ethnologist, whose name I knew from the newspapers. He was seeking, as it turned out, a companion and secretary, an educated person who would order his papers and give his two children, he was a widower, a little instruction. Within a week I was in his household, and I say it simply as it was, this man saved my life. And for it I kept him a loyalty that was later put to hard tests. The work was pleasant, the professor kindly, the children lovable, and for some months I revived, like a plant that is moved into the light. Only one thing struck me with time. Beside his official work, the skull measurements and tables of peoples that had made him famous, there was a second work of which he never spoke. Sometimes he shut himself in with certain papers that were kept in an old writing desk whose key he carried on his person. Sometimes he broke off in the middle of a dictation and stared long out of the window with an expression I could not interpret, half fear, half an almost hungry longing. And one evening, as I brought him the post unannounced, I saw on his desk, on black velvet, a small object lying. A stone, dark and glossy, of the shape of an old seal, covered with engraved characters such as I had never seen. The professor, when he noticed me, laid his hand as if casually over it. But I had seen his look before he did. It was the look of a man guarding a treasure or a weapon. In the spring, the professor informed us that we would leave London. He had rented for the whole warm season a country house in the west, in Wales, at the edge of a broad river valley, for the air and the recovery, he said, and for the children. But I saw how his hands trembled as he folded the letter of acceptance, and it was no trembling of recovery. The house lay wonderfully, an old gray building on a slope. Before us, the valley with the sluggishly glinting river, behind it, woods, and over it all, toward the west, a chain of bare, rounded hills, gray and still, that closed off the sky like a rampart. From the first day I noticed how the professor's gaze went again and again to these hills. At breakfast, by the window, on walks, in the evening, on the terrace. He looked at them as other men look at the sea, as though behind them lay that for which they live. Once, in the first days, I stood beside him, and he said more to himself than to me that this was a very old land, older than the churches and the graves knew, and out here, where the Roman roads ended, much had held on that elsewhere had long since passed away. I asked what he meant. He smiled and spoke of legends, of the stories the country people told, of the little people in the hills, of the fairies, as they still feared them here, not loved them. One set out milk before the door at night and avoided certain places. Superstition, I said. Certainly, he said, superstition. And then, after a pause, with a voice that sounded different, but have you ever asked yourself, Miss Lally, why this superstition is the same all over the world? Why the Irish and the Welsh and the Bretons and the people in far lands who never heard of one another tell the same stories of a small, shy, ancient people that dwells in the hills, that avoids humans and steals children and speaks a language no one understands. Smoke, he said. There is not so much smoke without a fire that once burned. That evening I took it for a witty play of thought, such as scholars love. But in the weeks that followed, one thing fitted to another. I ordered his papers and came upon, within the limits of what he let me see, strange things. Maps of the region into which small signs were entered in red ink, at places where there was nothing but heath and rock. Newspaper clippings, years old, about people who had vanished in these hills. A shepherd here, a child there, never explained. Copies of old court records in Latin, and again on loose sheets, in pencil, rows of characters. The same characters I had seen on the Black Seal. On a rainy afternoon in June came the conversation that changed everything. I had put a question to him about a manuscript, a harmless treatise, and he suddenly laid down his pen and said it was time I learned what I was helping to work on, at least as much as he dared to speak. And then he told, in the gray light of the window, with a soft, precise voice, the story of his secret years. Long ago a thought had come to him, half in jest, as the great thoughts come, that behind the fairy legends of the peoples something real might stand. No magic, no spirits, but a race, a very old, very small human stock, driven back by the farmers who came into the land thousands of years ago, retreated into the trackless hills, into caves and hidden valleys, grown shy, gone wild, lingering in the dark while outside history went on, and in the tales of the victors shrunk to fairies and goblins, feared as the little people. At first, he said, he had laughed at it himself. Then he had begun to collect, on the side, over years, the legends, the court records of inexplicable incidents in remote regions, the reports of the vanished, the finds of strange stone tools in caves where no farmer ever lived. Each piece by itself was nothing, chance, superstition, fraud. But all of it together, laid over centuries and countries, made a pattern. And the pattern pointed always to the same places, to limestone hills like those out there before our window. And then the seal had fallen into his hands. He unlocked the writing desk and laid it before me on the black velvet. The small, dark stone, hardly bigger than a snuff box, smooth as if from 1,000 years of use, and engraved into its surface the characters, lines and angles and winding strokes that resembled no alphabet in the world that I knew. This, he said, had been found 60 years ago in this region, in the digging of a ditch, and had reached his hands by roundabout ways. The scholars to whom it was shown back then had declared it a forgery or a plaything of nature, but he had found the characters again, and here he lowered his voice. Found them again on a rock in the hills, not 5 miles from this house. incised into the gray limestone, weathered by thousands of years, and yet the same characters, stroke for stroke. "A writing," he said, Miss Lally, "a writing older than everything we call history. And a people does not write and then vanish. A people that writes leaves heirs." A few weeks after that conversation, the professor brought home a new member of the household. He had noticed him in the village, and he presented him to us as an errand boy and garden helper. Gervase Craddock, a boy of perhaps 14, the child of a poor widow from the cottages at the edge of the hills. I confess that at the first sight of him I grew uneasy, and I was ashamed of it, for the boy could do nothing about his appearance. He was small for his age and of a strangely squat build, the face broad and flat, the skin of a sallow olive tone that seemed foreign in this land of red cheeks, and his black eyes stood a little slanted and looked past one into a distance in which there was nothing. He spoke little and haltingly, as though language were a borrowed garment that fit him nowhere rightly. The village people, I learned from the cook, avoided him and his mother. Of the father, who was said to have died before the boy's birth, no one spoke, and the old ones made a sign with their fingers when the name Craddock fell. The professor treated the boy with striking kindness, and observed him meanwhile, as a collector observes a piece he cannot yet classify. That I saw, and it did not please me. One afternoon in high summer, the first thing happened. Gervase was working in the garden. I sat with the children in the shade when, from the vegetable bed, came a sound I will never forget. It was a voice, and was none. A gurgling and hissing, a stream of sounds that tumbled over one another, rough and guttural, and yet of a strange gliding melody, as though something there were speaking in great haste a language not made for human mouths. I ran over. The boy lay between the beds on his back, his limbs twisted, foam on his lips, his eyes turned up and away, and out of his mouth came this speaking that was no speaking, unbroken, urgent, as though under compulsion. A fit, they said later, the falling sickness. The child had had it always. The professor carried the boy into the house himself, laid him down, and watched by him, and as I passed the door of the study in the evening, I heard him pacing up and down inside, hour after hour. And once he stood still, and I heard him say, half aloud, with a voice in which triumph and horror were indistinguishable, "It lives. Great God in heaven, it still lives." From the day of the fit, the professor changed. The patience of the collector fell from him, and something feverish took its place. He now undertook long walks into the hills, alone, with map and hammer, and a bag whose contents I never saw, and returned in the evening with limestone dust on his boots and a face that was at once exhausted and excited. The rows of characters on his desk multiplied, and beside them now lay books on the languages of the East and treatises whose titles I did not understand. But with Gervase Craddock, he played a quiet, patient game that it cost me an effort to watch. He let the boy busy himself in the study, spoke individual sounds to him as if in passing, and observed him over the edge of his papers. Twice more that summer the condition came over the boy, once at night, so that the whole house woke from the hissing and gurgling, and both times the professor was the first at his side with a notebook. I could bear it no longer at last, and confronted him. I said I did not understand his science, but I saw a sick child being observed like a specimen, and that this was not the kindness for which I revered him. The professor took it without anger. He was silent a long while, and then he said something that ran colder through my limbs than any reproach. "Miss Lally, if I am right, then there is nothing sick about this boy. Then in his fits there speaks out of him only something that is older than he. Then his poor mother experienced something in the hills 15 years ago, of which the village to this day speaks only with finger signs. And the boy is the living proof of my whole work. That people has not died out. It has propagated into here, into our world." I said that was monstrous. "Yes," he said calmly, "that is the right word." And then he stepped to the window, looked over to the gray hills, and spoke the sentence that has not left my mind since. "People believe that horror dwells in the distance, in abysses and on foreign stars. But the true horror is patient, and has dwelt beside us from of old, in the silent hills before our door. And it waits only for someone to knock." I asked him whether he intended to knock. He did not answer. But that night I saw from the corridor window light in his study until morning, and the next day he began to order his papers like a man preparing a journey or a will. The last days came with a strange cheerfulness. The professor that week was relaxed as seldom before. He jested with the children, complimented me on my ordering of his papers, and once, after dinner, he even played the country house's out-of-tune piano. Today I know that it was the cheerfulness of a man who has closed a long account and is ready to pay the sum. On a gray, windless morning at the end of August, he came to breakfast in walking clothes, booted, his stick in his hand, and said casually that he would spend the day in the hills. We should not wait supper for him. Perhaps he would also stay the night at an inn in the neighboring valley. That depended on the weather. He said it lightly, too lightly. At the garden gate he turned around once more and looked back at the house, at the windows of the nurseries, and raised his stick in greeting. And I stood at the window and waved, and something in me knew in that moment that I was seeing him for the last time. He did not come back that evening, and not the next. On the third day the search began, with men from the village, with dogs, for days. His way was traced a little distance. A farmer had seen him on the first morning at the old stone bridge, a shepherd boy later at the edge of the gray hills, climbing the path up to the limestone rocks. There, where people do not like to go, and for which they name no reason. There, every trace was lost. No cap, no stick, no sign of a fall, no torn-up earth. The hills are bare. There is neither bog nor deep ravine there. A man is as visible there as a fly on a sheet. And yet Professor Gregg had vanished, as though the landscape had breathed him in. After weeks, the search was given up. An accident, said the authorities. A fall into a hidden cleft. Such things happened. The house was broken up. The children went to relatives, and to me, the lawyer, following the professor's instructions, handed a sealed packet on which stood, in his handwriting, "For Miss Lally, to be opened if I do not return." I could not bring myself to it for a long time. Only in the winter, back in London, on an evening on which the wind was blowing, did I break the seal. In the packet lay his secret papers, the black seal, and a letter to me, many pages in his clear, firm hand. This letter I will now give again, for it is the testament of this story, and I give it again as well as my memory allows. From the professor's letter. My dear Miss Lally, so it began. If you read this, I am either dead or in a place from which there are no letters. and you have a right to the truth that I dared to give you only in pieces. You know my thesis. You know the seal. You know the boy. What you do not know is the last link. The characters of the Black Seal. I have read them. Do not say that is impossible. It has cost me 15 years, and the key was given in the end not by my cleverness, but by poor Gervais. The sounds that speak out of him in his fits, I noted them syllable by syllable over months, and they fitted to the characters of the stone like a key into a lock. It is a language, Miss Lally, and the stone is what I always suspected, a testament of that people that was before we were. What stands on the seal I will not set down for you in full. Some of it shall go under with me, and you will presently understand why. This much, though. It speaks of the dwellers beneath the hills, of their gatherings at the old stones, and of transformations and arts for which our language has no words and our science no disciplines. What the legends of all peoples murmur stands there in bare characters as the knowledge of those who possess it. And now the last thing, and I write it with a calm hand. I have found in the limestone rocks the place that the seal marks. The characters on the rock, you know of them, are waymarks, and I have deciphered them as a traveler the milestones. I know now where to knock. Tomorrow I go there, alone, for what dwells there shuns the many and shows itself, if at all, only to the single one. So it stands on the stone, and so all the stories of the country people bear witness. Call it presumption, but a man who has given his life to a question cannot turn back before the answer, even if he dreads it. And I dread it, Miss Lally. I will not conceal it. I have made provisions. If I return, I burn this letter, and you never learn how near to madness I seemed. If I do not return, then do not search for me, and let no one search. Up there is nothing to be found that humans should find. Nor believe that I went lightly into my misfortune. I go with open eyes as a researcher to his object, and if it is an error, then it is mine alone. The seal I lay in your hands. Show it to no one. The world is not ready for this knowledge, and perhaps, mercifully, it never will be. Farewell, my dear, and think of me without grief. Most people die without ever having learned whether their life was given to a truth or to an error. To me, one of the two will be certain tomorrow, and that is more than a researcher may ask. So the letter ended. I have done what he asked. I have never had anyone search again, and I have kept silent. Until today. The seal lies in my writing desk, wrapped in black velvet, and I have not looked at it since that winter evening. But on some nights, when the wind comes from the west, I seem to know that Professor Gregg has received his answer. And I pray that it was the one he hoped for. That was our short retelling of The Novel of the Black Seal by Arthur Machen. A scholar follows a question to the edge of the knowable and steps beyond it with open eyes. And what he found, the silent hills keep to themselves. Perhaps that is the core of all the old stories, that the riddle remains, and only the questioners go. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.